Ready, explore? JustProfessor here. Your brain is terrible at probability, like embarrassingly bad, and I can prove it to you right now. If I ask you what's the chance of dying in a plane crash, you'll give me one answer. But if I ask you what's the chance of dying from engine failure, pilot error, bad weather, and terrorism combined, you'll give me a way higher number, even though I'm asking you the exact same question. Your brain just broke math, and you didn't even notice. This happens to everyone, every single day. Your brain looks at the big picture and comes up with one probability. Then it looks at all the small pieces that make up that big picture, and suddenly the numbers don't add up anymore. The pieces are bigger than the whole. That's impossible, right? But your brain does it anyway. It's called the subadditivity effect, and it's making you overestimate risks, waste money, and make terrible decisions based on numbers that make no sense. So, what exactly is the subadditivity effect? It's when you think the probability of something happening through specific ways is higher than the probability of that same thing just happening in general. Let me break that down with a simple example. Imagine I ask you, what are the chances you'll die in the next year? You might say, I don't know. Maybe 1 in 1,000? Now imagine I ask you a different question. What are the chances you'll die from a car accident, heart disease, cancer, stroke, or an accident at home in the next year? You add up all those individual risks in your head, and suddenly it feels way higher, maybe 1 in 100. But here's the thing. The second question is just a more detailed version of the first question. The total probability should be the same or lower, not higher. But your brain makes it higher anyway. This is breaking a basic rule of probability. The whole has to be equal to or greater than any of its parts. If you break something down into pieces, those pieces can't add up to more than the original thing. That's like saying a pizza has 8 slices, but if you count each slice individually, suddenly you have 12 slices. It doesn't make sense. But your brain does this with probability all the time. Here's why this is such a huge problem. Companies and advertisers know about this bias and they use it against you constantly. Think about insurance. When you're buying insurance, they don't just ask if you want coverage. They break it down into specific scenarios. Do you want coverage for fire, theft, water damage, natural disasters? Each one sounds scary on its own, so you think the risk is higher, and you end up buying way more coverage than you actually need. You're paying extra money because your brain is bad at adding up probabilities. Or think about health scares. The news loves doing this. They'll run a story that says, your risk of cancer is X%. Then a week later, they'll run 5 different stories about lung cancer, skin cancer, breast cancer, colon cancer, and brain cancer. Each story makes it sound terrifying. You add them all up in your head, and now you think your risk of getting cancer is way higher than it actually is. You start panicking, buying expensive supplements, or getting unnecessary tests because your brain turned one risk into 5 separate risks and made the total way bigger than it should be. This even affects how you spend money. Let's say you're planning a vacation. If someone asks you how much the trip will cost, you might say $2,000. But if they ask you how much you'll spend on flights, hotels, food, activities, and souvenirs, you start listing out numbers for each category. $500 for flights, $700 for hotels, $400 for food, $300 for activities, $200 for souvenirs. Add those up and you get over $2,000. But you already said the trip costs $2,000 total. The detailed breakdown just made the cost feel higher in your mind, even though it's the same trip. Here's another way this shows up. Imagine you're worried about your house getting broken into. If I ask you what's the chance of a break-in this year, you might say 5%. But if I ask you what's the chance someone breaks in through the front door, back door, window, or garage, you start thinking about each entry point separately. Each one feels like its own risk. So you add them up and think the total risk is 15 or 20%. But it's still the same event. A break-in is a break-in. It doesn't matter which door they use. Your brain just made the risk 4 times higher by breaking it into categories. So why does your brain do this? Why can't it just add correctly? The problem is that when you think about specific scenarios, each one creates its own mental image. You picture a plane engine catching fire. You picture a pilot making a mistake. You picture a terrorist attack. Each image feels real and scary on its own, so each one registers as a separate risk in your brain. But when you think about dying in a plane crash in general, it's just one vague idea. It doesn't trigger as many mental images, so it feels less risky. Your brain is also really bad at thinking about overlapping categories. When you hear heart disease, cancer, stroke, you don't automatically think, wait, some of these might overlap, or wait, there are other ways to die that aren't on this list. You just hear 3 scary things and add them up. You don't consider that the total has to include everything, not just the parts you listed. This gets even worse when the categories sound more specific and detailed. The more detail you add, the more real it feels, and the higher your brain estimates the probability. If I ask you the chance of dying in a car crash, that's one thing. But if I ask you the chance of dying in a car crash caused by a drunk driver, on a highway, at night, in the rain, now it sounds way more specific and vivid. Your brain thinks, wow, that's really detailed. It must happen a lot. But actually, adding all those details makes it less likely, not more likely. The more specific you get, the smaller the probability should be. But your brain does the opposite. Let me give you a real example of how this affects decision-making. Let's say you're deciding whether to invest in the stock market. If someone asks you what's the risk of losing money, you might say 30%. But if they ask you what's the risk of losing money due to a recession, company bankruptcy, market crash, bad management, or new competition, you start adding up all these specific risks. Now it feels like there's a 70% chance of losing money. Same investment, same risk, but the way the question was framed changed your entire perception of how risky it is. And that might change your decision about whether to invest at all. This also shows up in politics and social issues. People overestimate crime rates because news reports break crime down into specific categories. Murder, robbery, assault, car theft, each category gets its own story, its own headline. So you add them all up in your head and think crime is way worse than it actually is. But if you just look at the total crime rate, it's usually way lower than what your brain calculated by adding up all the categories. So how do you fix this? How do you stop your brain from doing this terrible math? First, whenever someone gives you a list of specific risks or costs or probabilities, stop and ask yourself if these are separate things or just different ways of describing the same thing. If they're different versions of the same event, don't add them up. The total can't be bigger than the sum of the parts. Second, always compare the detailed breakdown to the big picture number. If someone tells you there's a 10% risk of something happening, then lists 5 ways it could happen, and each one sounds like a 5% risk, your math is broken. Go back to the original 10% and ignore the breakdown. Third, be really careful with vivid, specific scenarios. The more detailed and scary something sounds, the more your brain will overestimate the probability. A plane crash caused by engine failure during a storm at night sounds way scarier than just plane crash. But it's actually less likely because it's more specific. And finally, remember that your brain is wired to be bad at this. It's not your fault. This bias is built into how humans think. But now that you know about it, you can catch yourself when it happens. When you start adding up specific risks and the total feels way too high, that's your signal to step back and check your math. Look, the subadditivity effect is one of those biases that sounds technical and boring, but it's actually controlling huge parts of your life. It's making you overestimate dangers, spend money on things you don't need, and stress about risks that aren't as big as you think they are. And the worst part is, it's so subtle that you don't even notice it's happening. The truth is, your brain isn't built to handle probability. It's built to survive. And for survival, it's better to overestimate risks than underestimate them. If you think there's a lion behind every bush, you might waste energy running away from nothing. but you'll also avoid getting eaten. But in the modern world, this survival instinct just makes you anxious and irrational. You're not running from lions anymore. You're buying extra insurance, avoiding safe activities, and making decisions based on math that doesn't add up. So next time someone tries to scare you with a list of specific risks or sell you something by breaking down all the ways it could go wrong, remember that your brain is going to make those numbers bigger than they should be. Take a step back, look at the big picture, and ask yourself if the math actually makes sense. Because most of the time, it doesn't. If this made you question every probability you've ever estimated, subscribe.